Hello and welcome everybody to our second session of the SAFE North American Monarch seminar series. My name is Zach Kazan. I am a conservation biologist and the conservation manager at Disney's Animal Kingdom, based here in Florida. And I'm very excited today. We got great feedback after our first session. And a reminder, if you missed that one, it is up on YouTube at the SAFE Monarch YouTube channel. So I can send that over afterwards, along with this one after the fact. There's going to be amazing resources available coming from this session as well. You'll be able to get that. I will try to put it up into the info part of the recorded session. Also, you don't have to be an AZA member to be a part of the Connected Community email listserv. You can sign up for there, and that's where you get lots of great information coming out from that. So we have an awesome session today. It is going to be hosted by Katie Lynn Bunny, the education coordinator from Monarch Joint Venture. And she's going to be giving us some conservation highlights of the monarch butterfly. A lot of people have been asking for this, want to know the latest and the greatest info coming out on the monarch. And there's no better person on the planet, in my opinion, than Katie Lynn to give us this information. She's going to talk for about 40 minutes. We'll have 20 minutes afterwards for a facilitated Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box down below, and we will address that at the end. But with that, I would love to pass it over to you, Katie Lynn.
Thanks, Zach. I don't know if I'm the best person, but I'm really great. I can think of a few other people who could do just as good a job. Well, hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I am the education coordinator for the Monarch Joint Venture. And if you're not familiar with the Monarch Joint Venture, I can give you a brief introduction to our organization. My role right now with AZA SAFE is I sit on the steering committee for the group as a whole. So I'm in on a lot of meetings with Zach and Rebecca and other folks on the steering committee. And that committee overlaps a lot with MJV's partners. We are a partnership organization. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment here. But for those of you who do know me, it's good to see you again. I see some familiar names in the attendee panel, so it's good to see your names there, even though I can't see your face. I am based in Minnesota in the Twin Cities area. So if you're local, you can feel free to pop on over and say hi. Our offices are in St. Paul. Otherwise, I'm always available by email. You can email me or call me anytime with any questions. More than happy to be a resource for all of you if you are so inclined. So the Monarch Joint Venture, like I said, is a partnership organization. As of yesterday, we have 116 partners, and our partners range anywhere from government federal agencies like the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, all the way down to small nonprofits and other collaboratives like the Nebraska Monarch Pollinator Initiative, Butterfly Pavilion, which is another AZA group here. A couple of you might recognize other zoos or museums on here. So we've got a lot of variety in the type of partners that we have, but all of our work centers around these 4 pillars of our conservation plan, which are partnerships. That's kind of the bread and butter of what we do. But all of those are based in science, education, or habitat. And some of them have more than one focus. Some of them have just one particular focus. It sort of depends on the group. But we all work to conserve this wonderful organism, the monarch butterfly, which is why you're all here today too, why you joined the SAFE program for North American monarchs. So this presentation isn't going to focus on the life cycle of the monarch or a lot of the biology, although I will cover briefly their migration, because I feel like even those of us who are in the conservation sphere, the migration itself is sometimes a mind bender because it's just a good example of why the conservation for this organism is so complicated. But because all of you are a little bit newer to monarch conservation, or maybe you aren't, but I wanted to make sure that you're all aware of some of the history of this conservation work that's happening. So monarchs are a North American species. They've been around for millennia, but they kind of came to the forefront of everyone's minds collectively as a society in the 1970s when Fred Urquhart did his Insect Migration Association tagging program for monarchs to try to discover where they were migrating, where they went to during the winter. He noticed it as a boy, as an adult, and then he enlisted the help of citizen scientists, everyday people, to tag butterflies to try to figure out where they went. There's a really good film on this called Flight of the Butterflies on that story. It's really great. It's an IMAX Omni type film that you can find it streaming. I think it's on Amazon. It was on Netflix for a while, or you can purchase the DVD too. Or check out your local science museum to see if it's showing there, because it's really cool on the big like IMAX Omni screen too. It's only 43 minutes long. It's a nice classroom video. That discovery obviously was known to the people around the overwintering sites in Mexico, but was a big news piece to the rest of us who don't live there. It made the cover of National Geographic in 1976, August edition, if you want to look it up. And there's a really good story in there with phenomenal photos of all of that. And then in the last 30 years or so, since the 1990s, there have been more and more conservation work that's been happening, more community programs, more action plans. The Monarch Joint Venture was formed in 2008. And then in 2014, a petition was issued to the US Fish and Wildlife Service to list monarchs under the Endangered Species Act. And that kicked off this huge, like now decade-long process of trying to learn more about monarchs to figure out what's driving their decline, what we can do to help, and what our goals need to be to make sure that we've been successful in all of that. And so there were a lot of landmark papers that were published within the last 8 years because of this listing process decision. The decision came down in 2020, not going back 100 years. In 2020, a couple of years ago now, or a year and a half ago, I should say, that monarchs are considered warranted but precluded for listing under the Endangered Species Act. So if you're not familiar with what that process looks like, essentially the petition starts off this 90-day finding. And then at the end of that finding, at the end of that process, if it's decided that it's warranted to go further along in the process, the Fish and Wildlife Service begins this species status assessment. And that took place for monarchs between 2015 and 2018. And that's just a way to collect a whole lot of data, analyze a whole lot of data, and publish as much as possible, and to determine what the actual status is for the species as a whole. It also created this monarch conservation database where people are able to upload the work that they're doing to conserve monarch butterflies. And then, like I said, that listing decision came down in 2020. It was delayed by a year and a half. It was supposed to come down in June of 2019, but they asked for an extension and were granted it in order to analyze and interpret some more data that was coming in. And as I mentioned, the decision was that monarchs are warranted but precluded by other higher priority species. Now, what that means is that they will go through an annual review every year from now on, an annual review process from now until 2024, and they are expected to be listed in 2024. They could be listed before then if the data show that it's warranted before then, but right now there are other species that have a higher priority for conservation concern. So how did we get here? How did we get to the point where this iconic butterfly that's so well known and well recognized across North America is up to be listed under the Endangered Species Act? You know, I wasn't alive when the bald eagle was listed under the Endangered Species Act, but based on stories from conservationists that I've talked to and people in generations older than mine, it feels a lot like that. You know, monarchs may not be the most efficient pollinators, but they are what sort of rallies people together. They're kind of this canary in the coal mine sort of organism where if something is common with as common of a host plant as milkweed is visibly declining, where people who are not in on, you know, insect conservation or ecology even are remembering that they used to see more monarchs growing up than they are now. If it's that obvious, what else are we missing? So one of the great things about monarchs, like I was saying, is that they are this charismatic organism. People love them. And one of the reasons that they're so charismatic is because A, they're common, but also they have this fantastic migration. They have a two-way migration, one of the most spectacular migrations on the planet. There's several dozen probably documentaries on migration that include the monarch migration in them. They're the only insect that has such a two-way migration. Other insects migrate. There are even other insects that migrate further than monarchs, but monarchs are unique in this particular phenomenon because it's one generation that goes down, and then they have that same generation begins the return migration in the spring. So the fall migration begins sometime in August in the northern parts of the US and southern parts of certain provinces of Canada. They take a couple of months to get to central Mexico or the coast of California, and then they spend the winter there. And that overwintering generation can live up to 9 months. So that generation is outwardly identical to the monarchs that were breeding throughout the summer, but inwardly are not fully mature yet. They are in a state of reproductive diapause, so their reproductive organs are not fully mature yet. They delay that in order to both prolong their life and wait until conditions are more favorable for breeding. There's no milkweed available for them in the winter, so they can't breed. They wait until the weather and the milkweed is available. Monarchs west of the Rocky Mountains spend their winters in the groves of California, and these groves are made up of lots of different species, but some of the more common ones are eucalyptus trees, Monterey pine, and cypress, all along the California coast. What's more important is the microclimate that they're seeking. It can't be too hot, but it can't be too cold. If it's too hot, they'll burn through all of their fat stores and not survive the winter. If it's too cold, they'll freeze. And then monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains spend their winters in Oyamel fir forests of central Mexico. And those colonies can range in size from just a few trees to a few acres. And there's anywhere between 5 to 15 of them dotted along the mountain range of central Mexico. The Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, where most of these colonies are situated, is a protected area of Mexico. Not all of the overwintering sites in California are protected. Some of them are on public land, some of them are on private property, and some of them are managed by conservation professionals or state parks, things like that. So it's a little bit more complicated to like lay down blanket protections in California like they've done in Mexico. For the most part, monarchs in the overwintering sites aren't really doing a whole lot. They move very little, but as spring approaches and the weather starts changing, they start to become more active. They'll leave their roosts to find water and any nectar that might also be available to them. That nectar doesn't usually become available, at least in Mexico, until later in the winter when things start warming up. In California, nectar might be more available because of just the nature of the overwintering sites. There might be more people around with gardens and nectar plants available for the winter. So if you're on the California coast and you know you're near an overwintering site, you can plant nectar plants to help those monarchs survive the winter. Now the weather's changing, at least at least in other places. It still feels like winter here in Minnesota. It is actively snowing right now outside my window. But in central Mexico and the coast of California, monarchs are already on the move. They've already left their overwintering sites for the year, and they are moving northward or westward, or sorry, eastward, depending on where they're located in North America. This happens between March and April. And then those monarchs that are leaving their overwintering sites are seeking out milkweed. They're breeding along the way, laying eggs. And then once they've completed that part of their life, once they've bred and laid their eggs, their life is now complete. You know, they've done their biological purpose by passing on their genetic material, and now they can die, essentially. But then their offspring continue the migration northward. So their offspring, for example, here in Minnesota, we don't usually see our first adult monarchs until sometime in late May or early June. And those monarchs that we see here in Minnesota in May or June are either the children or the grandchildren of the monarchs that overwintered in Mexico. To put this in a different visual perspective here, I animated some monarchs flying through my screen here. So August through November, they're migrating to their overwintering grounds. November through March, this 4th or 5th generation, they are spending their winters hunkered down in trees, I should say up in trees, waiting for conditions to be right. Weather warms, they move northward again, laying eggs along the way. They die, their eggs grow up to be adults, and those adults continue the migration northward. Now, those monarchs that are reaching their breeding ranges in May and June, they only live about a month as adults, but we have monarchs all summer long. They breed multiple times. There are several generations that go through during the summer months, 2 to 3, depending on how warm it is, depending on drought conditions and milkweed availability, but generally 2 to 3 generations in the summer months. And then the migration begins again. So in total, it's 4 to 5 generations to complete the entire annual cycle of the migration. And for me, and I think to a lot of other people, what's really interesting and one of the most fascinating things about monarchs is that never have they been to those overwintering sites before, and they will never go to them again. And yet they are finding the same forests year after year. And they've been doing this for thousands of years, which I think is pretty amazing. Now, one of the questions that we get a lot is, do Western monarchs ever overwinter in Mexico? And part of this, I think, is because people are just curious, but also Eastern monarchs have tended to get the most fanfare because their migration is further. But a lot of people even in California may not realize that monarchs stay in California. They overwinter there. They don't have to go to Mexico. They have the conditions there that they need, but they do sometimes overwinter in Mexico. And we know this because of citizen science data, community science data through the Southwest Monarch study. The populations do mix. The Southwest Monarch study had tagged between 2014 and 2016 over 3,000 butterflies in southeastern Arizona, and some were recovered in Mexico and some were recovered in California. They were tagged on the same day at the same site, and they were recovered in both places, which indicates that the monarch migration dynamics, at least in the Western US, are much more complex than previously known, and that supports a long-held hypothesis between of a connection between Eastern and Western population. So these populations are genetically similar. They are nearly identical. You know, you could transplant one, don't do this, but you could transplant one from the east to the west or west to the east, and they would do the same things. There have been around 7 or 8 studies that show that North American monarchs are genetically similar. But there have also been some more recent studies that there are distinct genetic differences at the global scale. So this is a graph from a paper that looked at the genetics of 87 monarchs from all over the world. Each of these colored lines indicates a different genetically distinct group. So we've got the Pacific monarchs here, North American monarchs in yellow, Central and South America here in purple, Atlantic in blue here. This is Danaus irapis, which is the southern monarch that's native to South America. It's a separate species, but it does look physically similar to monarchs. But one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that commercially bred monarchs that you might purchase from a business selling them, are genetically distinct from wild monarchs in any population across the world. They are now genetically distinct enough that they branch out off on their own tree on this genetic analysis. And this is what one of the concerns is with not necessarily captively reared if monarchs are brought in from the wild, but from folks who might be purchasing monarchs for like a release day for whatever reason. It could be a wedding or a memorial or something like that, or a classroom. But if those monarchs have been genetically bred or commercially bred over multiple generations, they are now distinct enough that they don't match genetics of wild populations. They're still the same species, but it is concerning that this is happening. So part of why it's concerned is because of what's been happening with monarchs. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we estimate monarch population. I'll talk about Eastern first, and then we'll talk about Western. But this photo from Lincoln Brower, who was a renowned monarch researcher, this photo was taken in the 80s, so it's not quite as spectacular as this lately, but each of these trees are orange because they're covered in monarch butterflies. For those of you in the north, you might look at this and be like, oh man, those trees are dying. They look frostbitten, something happened there, but no, very much the opposite. They're very much alive with butterflies. So what scientists do in Mexico is essentially they go around and measure the area that these trees take up. So any tree that has monarch in it is flagged, either physically or through, geospatial stuff. And then the area of those trees is taken and then added up to create graphs like this. Sorry, I'll put the full map on there. So to create graphs like this, this is the best method we have for counting monarchs in Mexico. There are too many to count the same way that monarchs are counted in California, which is estimated by individuals. There are still millions, hundreds of millions in Mexico, and that's just too many to count by hand, essentially by eye. So the best methods we have right now is to measure the space that they take up. We do not yet have the numbers for the 2021-2022 season. It's been delayed. Hopefully we should have that really any day now, but I have no more information than anyone else at this point. I've been checking my inbox almost obsessively waiting for the news, but right now our official count for the 2020 and 2021 season is the most recent data we have for Eastern monarchs. They were measured at 2.1 hectares in Mexico last winter. And we'll see what the news brings for this winter. Hopefully it's more, but we don't know. And then in California, oops, this arrow should be moved over a little bit. In California, monarchs are counted by volunteers. They are estimated by the number of individuals. This chart is showing, the green is showing the total number of monarchs reported here over time on the x-axis. And then on the blue line, those are the total number of sites that were monitored that year. In 2020, there were less than 2,000 butterflies counted in California. That was very alarming. Many of us were worried that that was the end of the monarch migration in the West. I know many of you probably felt the same way. We're wondering the same things. And then they started counting them this year, and we started getting reports from our colleagues in California saying they just found 20,000 at one site. Now the count's up to 50,000. And then the official count came up and it was nearly 250,000 monarchs in California this year, which is spectacular. That's amazing. It does not mean our work is done. It does not mean that they've recovered. I know all of you know this, but one data point does not mean anything. That's just one data point. So it's exciting. We don't know why the count was so much higher this year than it has been the past 3 years. But there's still a lot we can learn from this. I will share, and maybe I've already shared with this group, but I'll share a blog post from the Xerces Society. And I think I have another one from Chip Taylor or some other source. I'm not sure, I don't remember, but I'll share those out with everybody, talking about why we see these ups and downs in populations. Essentially, it's just natural phenomenon. Any population goes up and down like this. but we can talk about why it's such a unique or interesting thing to watch for monarchs. Now, I'm going to flip back to this chart here. I don't need to put a trend line on this to show you that monarchs are in decline on either of these charts. Monarchs are declining. The Fish and Wildlife Service wouldn't have put them as a candidate species if they weren't declining. We wouldn't be having this conversation if they weren't declining. The reasons behind this, primarily based on the data that we have now, are human-driven threats, such as habitat loss and climate change, and then particularly in California, pesticide use. And there have been lots of papers on all three of those things. But the loss of breeding habitat and hotter weather are associated with lower monarch populations. So that is a concern. If it gets too hot, they have a harder time surviving to adulthood or migrating through to, making it to the migration. So human-driven threats are the biggest concern. One question we get a lot from people are, I have so many predators in my monarchs or in my garden, I just want to bring all the monarchs in so I can save them all. Those predators are a normal part of life. Everything has them. And one of my colleagues at Monarch Watch said, and I use this phrase all the time now, we can't conserve one species at the expense of another. Monarchs have many, many natural causes of death, and it's known, it's been studied that only about 2 to 5% of eggs laid make it to adulthood. And that's normal. Lots of other species have the same sort of survival rates. Pretty much anything that lays a lot of eggs. Monarchs can lay between 300 and 500 eggs in their lifetime. You know, when you think of sea turtles or crocodiles or jellyfish, like things that lay a lot of eggs because survival is so low. So no, we don't need to save every monarch that's out in the garden because you're worried about predators. We can learn a lot about observing those monarchs and bringing some in for community science purposes, but saving every single monarch is not going to solve the problem of increasing the population because the limiting factor is habitat and climate change. We need to address those issues before we can even look at increasing the population. Now, one of the interesting things that I'm going to talk about here is some new research that shows some of the overlap between human-driven causes of decline and potentially, or not potentially, and natural threats like parasites. Project Monarch Health just released a new study on the parasite OE. And they've had several studies over the years, 9 or 10 papers have shown similar things, but there have been high levels of OE infection among monarchs breeding on non-native milkweeds in the southern US. And this would, the research didn't show it, but this would include California as well and other warmer states. This shows, they've also shown higher disease prevalence in non-migratory monarchs, like the monarchs that stick around in Florida. And there have been links between winter breeding, non-native milkweed, and higher rates of OE. And this has led to planting recommendations regarding tropical milkweed. I'll pop up this graph from Monarch Health's 2020 results. They've got infection rates listed here for different regions of North America. So Western monarchs have a 30% infection rate. Southern monarchs have a 47, almost 48% infection rate, whereas monarchs from the central and northern part of the US have anywhere between 8.9 and 9.6% infected of all the monarchs sampled there. Now, there might be some outliers here, like Florida, we know based on other studies that they've done have a very high infection rate, nearly 100%. So that could be bringing the total number of southern monarchs up a little bit. But in general, what is happening based on other data from Project Monarch Health, I apologize, this chart is a little blurry. But what is happening is this phenomena called migratory culling. So there are tens of millions fewer monarchs that reach overwintering sites in Mexico as a result of OE infections, which highlights the need to consider the parasite as a potential threat to the population. There have been increases in infection among Eastern North American monarchs since 2002 that suggests that changes to the ecology of monarchs or their environment has intensified the transmission of the parasite. So further work is needed to really examine to the degree to which all of that is happening in regards to human practices like mass rearing and the widespread planting of tropical milkweed, and how those things have contributed to that trend. This paper was just released earlier this year. I will share the citation link. It's unfortunately not open access, but you can email Anya, the author, and I bet she'll email it to you. But one of the things to note about this, there's still a lot that we don't know, but generally, I personally think the consensus, and I'm going to quote Karen Oberhauser because she was interviewed for the Popular Science magazine because of this paper. And what she said that if there's a chance that mass rearing and planting of tropical milkweed is hurting monarchs, and I think there is a chance, then we shouldn't be doing it, at least not at the levels we are at now. So it is concerning. This paper is showing that there is potentially negative effects from rearing practices and tropical milkweed affecting the migration, which could then obviously affect the population. The paper compiled data on OE infection that spanned 50 years from wild monarchs sampled in the US, Canada, and Mexico, both during summer breeding, fall migration, and then also overwintering periods. They examined populations, west versus east, and they examined them separately to kind of look at those abundance estimates and resource availability, as well as climate, and then the length of the breeding season and how all of those can impact the trends of infection. They also assessed in this study the intensity of the migratory culling. And on average, the prevalence of heavily infected monarchs in North America was 10% higher across the entire data set, including Western and Eastern subpopulations in all years that monarchs were sampled. Sorry, it was 10% across the entire data set, not 10% higher. So this, we're looking at 4 times higher prevalence in Western monarchs than in Eastern. The percentage of infection of Eastern monarchs has increased 3 times since the mid-2000s. And the percent that has been infected of Western monarchs has declined from 2000 to 2015 and then increased. So there's some interesting trends happening. And if you're interested in helping Monarch Health, Project Monarch Health learn more about this, unless you're in California, you could look into testing monarchs in your area for OE to help us learn more about what's actually happening with monarchs here. So let's talk quickly about extinction risk. So there's a huge range in values between some of these. The quasi-extinction threshold for Eastern monarchs could be anywhere between 0.01 to 0.25 hectares. And the risk of reaching that is high. The risk of quasi-extinction by 2025 is anywhere between 3% to 42%. And by 2075, that risk increases by 48 to 69% if we go forward the way things are now and not do more for monarchs. The true threshold isn't known, so that's why there's some variation. This is based on expert estimates versus mathematical modeling. Now, the lowest number of hectares ever recorded was 0.67 in 2014. So we haven't reached that quasi-extinction risk threshold yet. Maybe we won't for Eastern monarchs. But essentially, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, but quasi-extinction is the point at which extinction is inevitable. The population is now below the point at which a species could potentially recover. It's sometimes called an extinction vortex, or the more morbid term, a death spiral. This is all biologically. So if you're interested in, saving a species from extinction, it can be doable with proper management of a small population, like in zoos. We could keep a species alive for a long time and manage its health and breeding activity. Obviously, you all know this, you work in zoos, that's what you do. Hopefully we won't get to that point for monarchs though. For Western monarchs, the quasi-extinction threshold is somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 monarchs. The risk of reaching this is very high, so high in fact that we've already seen it 3 times. The risk of reaching that is 50 to 75% in 20 years, and then 99% within 60 years. So we're not out of the woods. We are, we were below that threshold for 3 consecutive years. So while it looks, bad and concerning on the graphs, it definitely caught the attention of a lot of people. And a lot of us were really worried when we hit that below 30,000 mark. So then what does that mean? What should our target be? Do we need to aim for those quasi-extinction levels or something else? Essentially, no, we probably shouldn't reach just those goals. We should probably go a little bit higher. We should probably look at something like 500,000 monarchs in the West and 6 hectares of monarchs in the East, so that these targets are, they're comfortably above that quasi-extinction level. We don't want to get too close to that because that feels precarious, like we're just on the edge of something really dangerous. So if we can get things comfortably above, we can all rest a little easier at night. Now, I'm a huge proponent, and many of you might agree, that conservation requires hope. We need to be hopeful, or we will just be in, sad mental states all the time. And I like to end my talks on this hopeful note. We are not alone. And I don't mean that in like, yes, there's life on other planets sort of things. I mean that in, we're not the only ones working on this. I mentioned the MJV partnership already. We're 116 strong. And that's not even including, unofficial partners that we work with sometimes, but aren't listed as official partners on our list. There's also international work that's happening between the US and Canada and Mexico. All of these different organizations that are here are international organizations that are working in some way, shape, or form on monarch conservation in their respective countries. On the individual level, or the scientific community science level, someone somewhere is monitoring some parts of the monarch life cycle at any given point of the year, whether that's a volunteer in the summer or a scientist in Mexico studying the overwintering population. Someone is looking at some part of the life cycle. We have a close eye on what's happening, probably uniquely so. And then of course there's this wonderful group, the SAFE, the North American Monarch SAFE group. Sorry, my slides aren't advancing. There we go. So we are also the small community of conservation-minded folks who are concerned about monarchs, and we have plans here. We've got our SAFE Monarch plan. We've also, as the US, there are 2 separate regional plans for monarchs. There's the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. They have a conservation plan that includes a goal of 1.3 billion milkweed stems, an average Mexico colony size is 6 hectares. This includes goals and strategies and existing efforts broken down by states. This includes Kansas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. And I don't think Texas is on there, but Texas is included also. And it essentially identifies who's going to do what. And I'm not going to read all this out, but each state has their own specific habitat goal for monarchs. There's also a plan in the West. The Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies has this goal of by 2029, the preceding 5-year average of monarch butterflies counted will be 500,000, and that 50% of overwintering sites will be protected and actively managed for monarchs. And also a minimum of an additional 50,000 acres of monarch-friendly habitat provided in California's Central Valley and adjacent foothills. These are goals that were based in research that has been done, including data collected by volunteers. And then MJV also has our own implementation plan to help guide some of this work as well. I'm not going to discount the importance of community science. So if you want to get involved in community science at your zoos and aquariums with your, either with your staff on your own or with your visitors, these are the 6 that I recommend. These are the 6 that are the, you know, have the easiest entry level point. There's also things like iNaturalist and the North American Butterfly Association that aren't monarch specific, but still collect data on monarchs. And then I'll end on the simple things that I always tell everybody that they can do to help. And some of this is probably reflected in the SAFE Monarch plan, but essentially start by learning, exploring, learning more about monarchs, what you can do to help. The biggest thing anybody can do to help monarchs is to plant habitat. Then contribute to community science data. That can be any of the programs that I mentioned previously. And donate to a conservation organization where those dollars could be amplified to conservation efforts in places where it's needed most. And then finally, connect and share. This isn't just with the people at your who are visiting your institution. It can be with family members, friends, neighbors, communities, elected officials, anywhere in between. Connect and share, get the word out. Essentially, let's work together to protect this iconic organism, right? And know that we can all make a difference if we put our heads down and, you know, do the work that needs to be done. So with that, I'm going to end, and I think I ended at exactly 40 minutes.
You nailed it. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie Lynn. That was just such a phenomenal wealth of incredible information.
I see one question in the Q&A. Oh yes, what do I say to my mother-in-law who gushes at all the butterflies on her Rose of Sharon, non-native, in my plea to plant natives? Okay. I'm gonna take a sip. I'm not familiar with that particular plant, but what I tell others with non-natives aren't necessarily an enemy. Lilacs are not a native plant, but they are a really good early spring nectar plant. It's one of the first things that's blooming, at least here in Minnesota, other than the dandelions, also not native. So non-natives aren't necessarily the enemy or bad. The concern is when things like tropical milkweed are, you know, are beginning to show that the data are beginning to show that it is a concern because it's either pulling monarchs out of diapause, it's perpetuating disease, and then all of that can have an effect on the migration, as that recent study mentions. If it is a concern, like tropical milkweed, sometimes, as is the case with tropical milkweed at least, sometimes it's all that's available. So I would say do what you can to find a native alternative. There are so many plants out there that have a high quality nectar that also attracts a lot of butterflies. I'm not sure where you are, Jen, but one type of plant that I'll put out there, I think there are native species almost everywhere across the US, but Liatris or blazing star is an excellent native wildflower. It's a late blooming plant in most areas. It attracts all sorts of pollinators, monarchs, hummingbirds, bees, other types of moths and things like that. It's just an all around really great alternative. So I would say, let her keep it for now. Suggest other plants to add to the space that also attract monarchs and other butterflies. And then once those have been established, gently suggest removing the Rose of Sharon. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You can try again with another, another time or another type of plant or with a different issue. Sometimes showing her examples of what else is out there in a different space could also work. If you go to a native planting somewhere else and show her something that it can look really, really great as a native planting. Sometimes people hear native plantings and all they hear is weeds, but then they see a native planting and realize, oh, this actually looks really great. Maybe I'll try it, and start small.
Awesome. That's a great, I think that's a question that we can all relate to.
Yeah. I have concerns in my yard too.
I can relate to, the non-native, even the non-native milkweeds in my family's gardens. And to be totally honest, all over our own properties, that is a challenge. In fact, so much so that I'll just throw out a plug to our next session, which is going to be on May 12th, which is very specifically on native versus non-native milkweed. What is the difference and why does it matter? So I just wanted to throw out that plug, but it's an important topic and a great question.
There's another question in the chat. You mentioned about captive bred monarchs are genetically different, wondering, should we discourage people from using these in their classrooms? And is there something else that we could suggest to assist classrooms with their life cycle or butterfly lessons? I love this question. I get it all the time. So what I suggest to teachers who want to raise monarchs in their classroom varies depending on where they're at. If they want to do it in California, I tell them, I'm sorry, it's not allowed. It's against the law. Here are some alternatives to observe monarchs and report the data to a community science program to help us learn more. That also is the case in all of Mexico and some Canadian provinces. There are some laws against laws that you need a permit to handle monarchs in some Canadian provinces. For other areas, if it's a northern state like Minnesota, I might suggest observations just because monarchs aren't here when school is in session. Monarchs are returning just as school is getting out for the year, and monarchs are leaving just as school is starting again in the fall. So we don't always have here in the northern states the opportunity to have wild monarchs in the classroom. But in general, what I suggest is that if you want to raise monarchs, or really any animal, any invertebrate, not any animal, any invertebrate in your classroom, is to collect it from the wild. Make sure that you have enough of its food source to feed it, and then release it as soon as it's reached its adult stage. So what I recommend is somewhere between 5 and 10 monarchs per classroom. I know 10, 15, 20 years ago, you could find enough monarchs to give every single student an egg, or maybe 2 eggs, or an egg and a caterpillar, but we're just not there right now, at least not consistently enough to plan on that. There's also concerns with making sure that they're being reared responsibly, meaning in individual containers with data collection, processes in place to report them to a community science program. And the other thing I'll say is that if you are raising monarchs, you should also be submitting data to a community science program like the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, testing for OE with Project Monarch Health, or if it's in the fall, tagging them for a tagging program like Monarch Watch or the Southwest Monarch Study. And that's because by submitting the data to a community science program, you're sharing that experience with the community at large instead of keeping it in your little bubble of your home or your classroom, which is an amazing experience. I raise a handful of monarchs every year in my house with my son. I also bring them to my programs when I'm going to things in person. But I caution everybody to not do a lot, because doing more means that if disease does come through, it will affect more butterflies than if you didn't have as many. So you could also look at, so to answer the first part of your question, I would discourage them from purchasing monarchs to raise in the classroom and instead encourage them to collect them from the wild. You could also look into using other species like painted ladies, or even like Cecropia moths. Or what's another one? Like cabbage whites, things like that, that aren't quite as in dire concern as monarchs. Another question is, are there any policies or is there any policy in the works to ban tropical milkweed from nurseries? Not that I'm aware of. My understanding of the commercial plant business is that that would be very difficult to implement unless it was federally or mandated by a state government. And I don't know that I don't know if that would be high on the priority list of many politicians at this point. Not that it's not a worthy cause, but it's also, it's difficult to enforce, I guess is the word I'm looking for. I think a bigger impact would be consumer-driven responses to that. A similar thing happened with neonics. Before probably 2018, 2019, neonics were much more prevalent, or at least harder to spot, but still prevalent. Now, if neonics have been used to treat plants, it needs to be labeled, mostly because consumers demanded it. There's no law in place that says that, at least not that I'm aware of, that neonics need to be labeled as, especially for flowers. But now most large nurseries, even the smaller ones, will label the plant that's been treated with neonics. They may not do it in a way that warns you that it's bad for insects, but it at least says that it's been treated. And then Jen, for your other question about how they're tested for OE, I'm going to share out the Project Monarch Health website that has some instructional videos, but briefly, you need to collect the adult monarch, which is why you can't do this in California, but you need to collect an adult monarch. You get a kit from Project Monarch Health, or you can use similar items at home. But essentially you take a piece of tape or a round clear sticker. It needs to be clear tape, not the matte tape. Press it to the abdomen of the butterfly, which collects scales and spores of the OE parasite. And then you tape it to, or place it on an index card and nail that index labeled. You need to label your specimens and fill out the data sheet. And then you send that into Project Monarch Health. And then they analyze those results. It's not an immediate response like Journey North. You report a monarch to Journey North, you can see it right on the map. But Project Monarch Health, they need to look at them under microscopes to tell you what the result is. But they do get back to you on what those results are. If you have those tools at home, a microscope and the understanding of how to look for OE and use a microscope to look for OE, you could test them at home and then also send those into Project Monarch Health so that they can be added to the collective database. But I'll send the PMH website and links to how to do it. Did anything else come up in the chat? No. Okay.
Nothing's come up yet, but I have, I encourage anybody else who has questions to enter them. I have a question in the meantime, which is that you said you were waiting with bated breath for that email to come through with the latest numbers. For those of us that also want to know, when those numbers come out, or we get asked by guests, how the monarchs are doing at a particular time, what is the best resource to get the most up-to-date numbers on the populations at any given time?
Yeah, so MJV is kind of the one-stop shop for all of that. So we put out blog posts, news articles anytime anything big like that happens. So if you want that information, you can go to our website. The agency or the group in charge of counting monarchs in California is the Xerces Society. So they put out a press release in usually January when they have all of their numbers tallied for Western monarchs. So you can get on their mailing lists or keep an eye on their blog. Most of MJV's monarch specific partners do something similar. But if you want to, if you want just one thing to keep track of, you can just go to the MJV website. And when I get the news, I will be sure to forward that news to the AZA Monarch Safe list, the email list. So if you're not on that, sign up for it. Zach has the information on how, so that you can get that news right away. Otherwise, any of our social media or our blog posts on the MJV website is a good place to start. But I also know some people follow just one or two Monarch organizations like Monarch Watch or Journey North. They will all have the same information. They'll all put the news out. So if you follow any one of us, it's fine. But MJV is the collective of all news. So yeah.
Excellent.
I just looked at my email again. Still nothing.
Still nothing?
Still nothing.
Right on.
So.
Well, fantastic. That about closes us out. Those were great questions, great answers, and just a wealth of information. Thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. And thanks for everybody who was able to join us. I did hear from a couple of people that, once again, we had some issues with getting into the session. As Kitty Lynn mentioned, the best way to get information about these sessions, the invite links, everything else is through the AZA Connected Community Monarch SAFE list. That email resource is where I will send out those links. I think part of the reason that there's a little bit of confusion is that I had initially sent it out as just a normal Zoom link, but then in the last session we wanted to do polling and a number of other features that require you to do a webinar. So I had to set out a new link, and so there was some confusion there. But going forward, there will be a fresh, unique link for every single seminar. So please sign up for that email distribution list through AZA, and that's where you'll get the most up-to-date information there. And I will also send out the link to this recording shortly after we finish, and I have to upload it, and it takes a while to compress and everything, but that will be going out soon.
And I'll make sure I share out.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, I'll make sure I share out my resource list. Zach, maybe I'll send the list to you, and then you can send the recording and the resources all in one email.
That sounds perfect. That sounds like a plan. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for joining us, and please join us on May 12th for the next session, which is all about tropical versus native milkweeds. Is there a difference, and why it doesn't matter? And I can tell you, I personally am super stoked about this one because it is something that I think about a lot. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your April. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.